Thanks for joining us. My name is Sudhir. I'm from Jom, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'm not going to give long introductions to everybody here because I think with the first question that we have, I'll allow them to introduce themselves as well. One thing I want to say is we could talk about anything. The range of interests among the four panelists is pretty broad, but we're going to focus specifically on independent media and the need for independent media, the workings of our outlets and our outlets' role in society. So for all other issues, not related to the topic today, please sort of approach the speakers after the panel if you have any other questions for them. In terms of the flow, I'm going to sort of zoom out first and ask some broad questions of all the panelists, and then we'll have an in-depth discussion with each of them about their respective outlets. And then we'll kind of zoom out again and ask a few more broad questions. I'll try and mention Jom wherever it's appropriate. And I think the idea is that they'll also ask me questions about Jom, and at the end they can especially ask more questions about Jom if they want. So let's.
Sudhir,
yeah.
Sorry, may I interrupt you? Can you tell people they can come forward and sit on the carpet if they wish to?
Oh, there's a space on the carpet here if anybody wants to sit on the ground here. Prime seating.
Thank you.
Whoever's at the back there.
It's also like one tiny little cow.
So our first question is, what is meant by the term independent? If the media are to be independent, who exercises oversight? And in the context of this question, I'll just ask each panelist to talk briefly about their outfit, about who founded it, about who owns it. These are important questions in terms of independence. So Pei from Conti, can we start with you and tell us a bit about Kontinentalist, who owns it, who founded it, what are you independent of, what are you dependent on? And I'll prompt you some more, so yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming to today's event. It's a really wonderful turnout, and I think very happy to be here. So, if you don't already know me, my name is Ping, and I'm the head and co-founder of Kontinentalist. We are a data-driven editorial studio and publication based in Singapore, and our mission is to what we call bring Asia to the forefront of global conversations, and we do that by trying to make information and data more accessible to the public. We basically recognize that a lot of organizations invest a lot of time and research, a lot of time and money into research, but that data is very poorly communicated most of the time. So our goal is to really try and make this more accessible and keep people more informed. In terms of our outfit, so Sudhir has prepared a bunch of questions, which I have also prepared some responses to. So even though I co-founded the outfit along with my co-founder, we are an organization belonging to a parent group called Potato Productions, and my co-founder, Mr. Lee Han-Shi, owns both the parent group and also Kontinentalist as an organization. He was an ex-journalist previously with Business Times, and comes from a family with a history of philanthropy, specifically towards education and health services in Singapore. And I think in his retirement years now, he essentially wants to do a little bit more. And a lot of the companies within Potato Productions focus on finding innovative solutions to drive social impact. So even though he does own the organization and funds a lot of our work, his presence is a very minimal one. He's very hands-off. We make 99% of our editorial decisions independently within our own team, and we only check in with him on financial matters, hiring decisions, or sometimes there are some topics that we do want to go into, and they are a little bit more of a sensitive nature. So we just do a check-in with him to ensure that we're on the same page and we have consensus doing so, because if anyone's going to get any directive, it's probably going to be directed at him. So I think it's important that we keep our very important stakeholder in the loop.
What's an example of sensitive topic?
Yeah, as an example of a sensitive topic. Recently, we published a story on sand mining. as part of a sort of regional, almost global effort with a group of journalists called the Environmental Reporting Collective. So it was kind of multiple outlets publishing on the same topic at the same time. And I think they wanted us to be kind of like the Singapore represent, given our country's very large footprint on sand mining and its relationship with it. So yeah, I think that's one of those things that we hear in the news, like we hear from other people anecdotal evidence of like, oh, if I ever pitch this in the newsrooms, I would be fired, you know, like we hear this sort of comment. So we just wanted to check in with him to understand the temper and the nature of the topic, but it's always like, okay, if we have solid evidence, just go for it. You know, it's not just making sure that we have solid evidence, we've checked our sources, we are confident of what we're saying, and therefore we can do it. I think it's just, you know, like, okay, we hold our heads together, make sure we're on the same page, and everyone's in agreement of what we're doing before we do so, yeah.
Let me just interrupt. Define data-driven stories. I'm unclear about what that means.
Okay, we have a question here about defining data-driven stories. I think that's a very good question. I would presume actually hopefully most stories are data-driven. And oh my god, goodness if they aren't. But I think for us, we try to look for a story where we can answer it purely from a data perspective. Not necessarily purely from a data perspective, but maybe data can be very, very insightful. And sometimes to a degree, almost like investigative journalism, where we ask questions or we collect our own data sets. So in one example, we worked with a group of grassroots, we worked with a grassroots organization called Women Unbounded, and their volunteers gathered news, went through news archives, newspaper archives and things like that to look for news articles around sexual violence in Singapore. And we use that body of evidence to then look into sexual violence as an issue in Singapore. So who's most affected, what sort of relationships do victims have with their perpetrators, where are these incidents happening, to then make a really informed insight to the topic and say that actually it's not stranger danger and it's mostly happening at home with people that we know. So I think that's kind of an example of data storytelling. Okay, I'll try and power through the rest of the questions. Who are we dependent on? I've kind of answered that. What is our relationship with the government? I'm not sure if it's accurate to even say that we have a relationship. We are our office is currently in a building that receives funding from MCCY, the Ministry of Culture, Communication and Youth, I think. Yeah. But they totally don't involve themselves in our work. It's some civic center experiment that we're in, but they're not present in our day-to-day work. We've also worked a few times with state-affiliated organizations on the studio side of our outfit. So we are a publication, but we also try to make money by running a studio site. So we run workshops, we do bespoke projects that apply the same skills. So we produce digital essays or reports for clients who have data products that they want to communicate better. So we've had some relationship with the government there, but again that's separated from the editorial department and they do not partake or have any influence in our editorial process. And then I don't know if I should jump to the last question of what structural biases affect our work. I think being in Singapore in general, that's a huge structural bias. And we're very cognizant that whatever we say has to be very, very carefully crafted, especially with the knowledge of the laws that are kind of like looming over us. And we are registered here in Singapore on Singapore turf. So I think even though we may not disagree, we may not agree with some of these legislation, we have to still abide. Because without abiding that, it might put our operations to jeopardy, and we have a very young team also, and some PRs on our team, and we want to make sure, they're looked after.
Thanks, Peng. I'll just ask one question to dig a bit deeper before I move on to Kage.
Yeah.
So your parent company is essentially owned by a rich person, essentially,
Yes,
right? I know Anshu as well, and
Yeah.
it's great that he's been doing so much in this space. But I guess my question would be around whether you can create your firewalls and protect editorial independence, right? But across the world now, one viable way of funding media is through rich people, right? Whether it's Jeff Bezos at the Washington Post or Jack Ma at SCMP. But I mean, the frequent worry with this model is that you are eternally dependent, or there's always a conflict with whoever that rich person might be, whatever organization that rich person might represent. Amazon in the case of Jeff Bezos. So how do you think about this sort of dependency on one rich person and any sort of interference that it might have with your editorial? Is that something that bothers you, and what sort of safeguards you have?
Oh yeah, these are the questions that keep me up at night all the time. Yeah, I think there's definitely the question of, I think dependency for me is a great worry. In our relationship, working with him, it hasn't been an issue where there is any sort of, very overt or even strong editorial influence. Even when we disagree on topics, he still defers to us to let us make the independent decision. And I think that's, that's great that he recognizes the importance and the need for that. But I think in terms of just sustainability of an organization, that definitely worries me a lot, which is why I don't like to use this word that often in the public, but I hustle very, very hard to make money on the editorial side, to make sure that we can, on the studio side, to make sure that we can keep things running and there's a viable business pathway. I think, especially when it comes to independent media, we often have this, and it was, some people talked about it earlier too, this idea of like, funding and giving like grants and so on and so forth. But really, I think people they really need to start seeing that this is hard work, and it's labor that needs to be paid for. Whether you're a reader, if you're consuming it, it's like, you don't eat food for free, right? Why would you read news for free? Why would you read quality journalism for free? And I think people need to start getting used to the idea of paying for it, especially if they want better quality journalism.
Wait, so the sort of the long-term aim is to just have constant revenues coming in, partly to lessen your dependence on a rich individual. Great. Kage from Ethos Books. Will you tell us a bit about your outfit, who founded it, who owns it, and
Thanks. First, I'd like to begin with good thoughts and greetings for everyone in the room, okay, just to calm myself down. Right. So, independent publishing house, that's what we usually say. So, usually independent means we struggle. So, I think we can all say, all four of us on the chair, we struggle with keeping the business going. Because if you are super well funded, right, there's a chance of capture. And I think what Ying mentioned about working very hard, I think it's about diversifying your dependency. You will always be dependent, but who do you want to be dependent on? So we want to be dependent on our readers, because that means they want our offerings. We want to be dependent also because I do have also a team, right, that we work on commission projects, commercial projects. So during the pandemic, when book sales went down, online algorithms were driving sales mostly of international titles. So Singapore titles, right, we will be not really discoverable. So when book sales tank, that's the literary side. We have a commercial side that is taking in projects. And so that side, we are dependent on partners and clients. We are sometimes in a good position to choose who to work with. We try to be smart. We also take on government commissions, like for example, Singapore Bicentennial. And why do we do that? Because our writers then get a chance to also feature on like tax-funded Singapore narratives. That's so powerful because people like Ariffin, he has his poems during Singapore Bicentennial. So, so I'm just going straight into this idea of dependency. I think in future, I also see that we need private patrons. That's another dependency we want to develop. And of course, if you are in a luxury to choose, we choose those who have less strings attached. And they just want to see, you know, the media and literary landscape blossom. Yeah, so maybe this is where I also want to like differentiate a bit because I think paying does data-driven storytelling. For us, the imagination is also very important. Imagination is actually, I feel, a substrata of civilization. It keeps us alive in ways that we cannot foresee based on current data. And I think our government, if they read more about books, we will have a better society. So, yeah. Maybe I go back to saying about our outfit. We have 11 full-timers. 5 work on Ethos Books projects, that's the literary side. 4 work on page setters projects, and I have actually 2 people in finance. Why do I want to point out numbers? Because I realized that to keep a business going, we need to know numbers. I actually hated numbers as a student. I got by because you need to get by with math, right? So, but it is important. It keeps me afloat. Now it keeps my team afloat. So it is a responsibility. All 4 of us, I'm quite sure, is on your cards as well. Not your like a best friend, but a needed friend. Yeah. So my finance manager and I also look after HR. So if you want to run an outfit, unfortunately, you need to also look after all the like structural needs. I say unfortunate because we want to work on trust, but in the nature of business, right, contracts are a safeguard for everyone, including your own self and your colleagues. So as for shareholders, right, there are 3 shareholders of the company. The founder is one of them, Ho Fang. I'm one of them, and there's also a silent partner. I love him because, of course, he's silent. He just lets us do, what we want. So we are not profit driven, although we are not for profit. Yeah. So that keeps us on our toes, I actually think. Literary publishing, traditionally, we depend on grants. When I first joined Ethos in 2014, we had like a large dependency on government grants. So right now, since 2018, our dependence on grants from, for example, National Arts Council is about 10% or less. So that like insulates us from, say, maybe sudden shifts in funding policy. And actually, if you all go search NAC website, I mean, to their credit, they are quite like clear about what they don't fund. It's just that I don't agree about what they don't fund, but they are clear about it. So, for example, they are very wary about funding religious, like kind of content, racial content about sex and things like that. So you just look at their guidelines, it's all there. And I find that that's where maybe we need to sort of have an active and vigorous debate about what should be funded, because in fact, everyone in this room, you have a stake because you're funding the government through your taxes, right? So if you all should want to read more of such things, please vote properly next time. So what is our relationship with the government? Open-ended, because you don't want to close the tap. We are not so, say, like, I would say, gung-ho and say, we will not take any grants. Of course I'll take grants when we can take grants, but the good thing is that if we know that our projects are not going to be funded, I'm not going to put anyone in a quandary by applying and then have the possibility of having any funds rescinded, because that will be no benefit to anyone. So I have to also say that we will support and benefit like infrastructure initiatives by the government, because for example, there is a Singapore Arts Plan happening soon. So they are going to consult some of us on how arts can be funded. I will definitely be there and I'll be asking them about funding matters and what to fund. Yeah, so I also recently went for an acceleration program for the arts. So that's co-organized by UOB and the National Arts Council. So those are kind of like training for publishers and media people. And so this is the kind of like I would say very fluid relationship that we have. Yeah. Structural biases, right? Anything that affects access to information, anything that affects your and my capacity to make sense of information, anything that affects our capacity to make decisions is a structural bias. Yeah, for example, right, my team diversity, we are now predominantly women. However, we are also maybe predominantly Chinese. That's a structural bias. I cannot avoid that. So how do we then be mindful of this and work alongside with this? So for example, our interns, then we try to bring in interns who are like of various ethnicities and nationalities even. Yeah. Then I think political system, I think Ping said it well, being in Singapore, there's a system that will have a structural bias on your decision making as well. The education we receive, yeah, I think I come from a certain background, so I also have to be very mindful about how I will be predisposed to certain interpretations. Yeah, so maybe that's quite a long.
Thanks. I'll just pick up on a couple of things. You said you are not profit driven. Is that? I mean, but you are a for-profit company. But so what do you mean that you're not profit driven?
Thanks for asking this question. No, because I do want to champion a kind of business where we earn just enough. I find that the current 1% who are earning so much that they can maybe fund the 90% or something, that is a problem that I hope to avoid in the business. We are definitely nowhere near that danger of earning too much. But if we ever are in that position, we will be sure. Okay, so actually I do hope that our team will eventually become like a shareholding company, so everyone owns a part of the company. But yeah, something like a co-op, right? But I tell them now that you don't want to be shareholding at the moment, right? You want to sharehold when there's like good stuff, but if there's a lot of risk, maybe don't sharehold at the moment. Yeah. So that's what I mean by, yes, we try to generate to cover costs, and your salary will rise over time, hopefully in line with the market. But I don't really think any of our team members are keen on becoming sort of super wealthy.
Yeah. So eventually moving to a lot of employee ownership, which is something we
I really hope for that.
hope to do at Jom as well. One other question. So I forget the number you said. 10% of your funding comes from government grants. Is that accurate or?
Yeah, because I have to also take into account during COVID we did get very like important grants, like the job support scheme. Wow, without the job support scheme, I think we will be not 11. Yeah, not 11. For now, we will be less than maybe half of the team size. We just cannot afford it. Yeah.
No, so in terms of preserving your independence, is there a number or a limit you think in terms of how much funding you should ever get from the government? You know, because I know outfits, it becomes 40%, 50%, 60%, and soon they are, in the pocket of the government in different ways. And to what extent your collaboration with the government might affect your own self-censorship of issues on certain things. Are these concerns of yours, and how do you think through them?
Yeah, I think maybe I want to sensitize myself also to the type of government support. Because let's say if I take a grant and it's specific to a project, that project is dependent. But as a team, right, if we lose that project, are we going to go down? So when it's a project-specific grant, it is very different from, say, maybe if my operating costs are funded by the government, which is never the case. Because right now, we are basically driven by, say, book sales and also commercial projects. Yeah. So in that way, but if you ask for a safety kind of percentage, if everything that you do, right, half or more comes from a single source, I think that's quite dangerous. I have a sense of that being a danger. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. So we'll move on to Ariffin from Wake Up Singapore. Thanks for joining us, Ariffin. Yeah, I guess maybe for you, in fact, this has been an even more pertinent question because
You don't have to ask me what's my relationship with the government.
I know. No, but for years people were like, "Who's behind Wake Up? Who's behind Wake Up?" Right? And you know, obviously in the last couple of years, I think it's become more apparent. So, can you also tell us about the origins of Wake Up Singapore, and was there a sort of deliberate effort to make the contributors and the personalities behind Wake Up, like put them a bit behind the scenes, be a bit more opaque about that in some way? Was that a sort of a deliberate thing as you built your audience primarily on IG, I think, but other platforms too? How do you think about, you know, your origin story and who's behind Wake Up and who funds it?
Yeah, I think firstly thank all of you for coming today. My introduction will be a lot shorter than the rest of the distinguished panelists because essentially we have no funding, no staff. So, you know, in that sense it's a lot easier. Yeah. So, Wake Up Singapore doesn't have like a very great origin story. I basically, I founded it at the back of my secondary school classroom when I was 16. Okay. And then between then and now, that was in September 2013. It started off as a Facebook page. And then between then and now, it has taken many different iterations. I myself have left twice and came back. So yeah, I mean, to answer your question, it wasn't really a conscious decision for us to not name our writers. We did have like a public editor-in-chief for some time, Sean Francis Hunt, for a period of time. But I think it's more of the comfort level of the writers themselves. So certain writers, they don't mind putting their name to things. Certain writers want to put their name to things for certain articles, but not other articles. So it depends on your own comfort level. So yeah, so it wasn't really a conscious decision. And in a sense, like where Wake Up Singapore is today is just a series of a lot of contribution by volunteers, a lot of accidents, because I can say with confidence that if you go to most parts of Singapore, I think half of them like Wake Up Singapore, half of them don't like Wake Up Singapore. And I think that's a sweet spot to be in, right? No, really. Because I think the day that you keep reaching an audience that already agrees with you is the day where you stop growing, right? And even the audience that doesn't agree with you, there will be times where they will agree with you. So for example, they may not agree with you when it comes to like the position you take during elections or whatnot, but they will agree with you when it comes to how migrant workers are being treated, or the way LGBTQ community is being treated. So, you know, I feel it's a sweet spot to be in when you are reaching out to people who disagree with you. And we have seen the data from our posts. So like sometimes your post can have, let's say, 1,000 likes or 10,000 likes or whatnot, but the reach of the post can be 100,000 or a lot more than that, which means that there are a lot of people who may not agree with you, but your content is still reaching them. And I think that's really important in Singapore's media landscape, because the moment you only reach people that already agree with you, I think we are losing the battle for influence. Besides that, yeah, I mean, just to be upfront, we only started taking Wake Up Singapore a little bit more seriously in terms of, okay, how do we start funding this? How do we start making it more sustainable? How do we start hiring people and making it something bigger than just a pastime sort of thing? In the last 2 years, because like what you said, sometimes when you grow enough, right, you will get offers for buyout, right? So we had some offers, and that's where we realized that, okay, maybe there's something here that has a bit of potential that we should try to cultivate. So, I mean, that's the position we are in currently. I think relationship with our government, we don't need to answer the question.
So how are you planning to grow your revenue and become sustainable? And
yeah, so
what are your thoughts around dependency as well? Because
correct. Yeah. Okay, for me, I take a slightly different approach. Rather, we take a slightly different approach. I mean, if there are rich people willing to fund us, then can meet me after this. But so far, I haven't met anyone.
So wait, just for context, so you got a couple of buyout offers, like you don't have to name who or what, but so what kind of, not rich individuals, are they organizations?
Organizations, collective, individuals, sort of thing, yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, we rejected all of them, but it's more of a wake-up call to say, hey, actually maybe there's something here, you know. But for us, okay, one thing for Wake Up Singapore, we find it very, very important is that your material must be accessible. Because I always say that if the man in the 3-room HDB flat cannot understand what you're talking about, then your message is not going anywhere. At least that's for Wake Up Singapore, right? Because and we use different mediums, videos, memes, articles, short Instagram caption, things like that. It may not agree with, I mean, it may not be everyone's cup of tea, but you know, we try different type of content. So bearing that in mind, like making your content very accessible to everyone. So one thing that we want to stay away from is paywalls, right? So I think what we want to try to do is either do an advertisement model or subscriber-based model, but then I'm also aware because of Singapore, you got all these rules, right? Like for example, one of the reasons TOC got into trouble a few years ago was that they said that you disguise your subscriber model as a donation, you know? So your subscriber model is basically donation in disguise because the subscribers don't actually get anything and things like that. So that's the tricky part that we have yet to figure out. Like how do you maintain accessibility at the same time collect funding without running afoul of all the laws? Yeah, so I mean that's something that we don't have an answer to yet. But
Wait, why are you die against paywalls?
no,
Nothing asking for a friend.
because no, I mean I agree with Ying. Like I think that eventually. Okay, I feel like okay, frankly speaking, I think the content we put out, the content you put out is a bit different. And I agree with Ying. I think eventually, if people start to pay for things, it will be good. But I think we are not at the state yet, and we are not in a position to change that state also. So I think like, I mean, okay, at least for Wake Up Singapore, right? End of the day, we are in the business of influencing minds, shaping narratives, pushing narratives, you know, sort of thing. So like, I think the moment you lose the accessibility, then it's very hard to continue playing in the space now.
I'll just quickly open up. Anybody had any questions
So
before I move
maybe
on?
you should just talk a little bit about Jom since.
Oh.
Come on.
Jom is a weekly digital magazine. We have we're focusing just on Singapore now. It's what we call a general interest magazine.
Behind the paywall.
It's I would say about 70% of our content is behind a paywall, and we've gotten about 1,100 paying subscribers now after 9 months. So our break-even point is about 3,000. So I think similarly to one of the things Paying mentioned earlier, we're also trying to encourage people to see the value of paying for good journalism, right? And I think there will always be free media out there, and there will always be people like us, I think, who try to charge for journalism and different models, as Ariffin said. And I think they all can coexist, actually. And what else should I say about Jom? Yeah, we're focusing on Singapore now, but we have grand aspirations to be a magazine for Southeast Asia. So once we're sustainable here, we do hope to move abroad.
With a little bit of a history, how did this concept start? How did you get about going about doing it, and a little bit of that would be interesting.
Yeah, sure. I think so. Long-form journalism, long-form writing is probably my preferred genre personally, right? And I think for several years I've been experimenting on my own with this in Singapore, and I got enough encouragement from different people to try and start something. So I mean, you know, as lofty an ambition as it is, I think the easiest analog is something like the New Yorker for Southeast Asia. So that's our grand ambition, and very deliberate in how we've gone about sequencing that growth, just focusing on Singapore and nowhere else, right? Because I think some other outlets try to focus on a much larger region, whether it's Southeast Asia or Asia, but we're very deliberate that we wanted to have that community, that loyal readership in Singapore first before we moved abroad. And so I think around the time of the last elections, in terms of funding, I might as well talk about funding since everybody else has, but around the time of the last elections, I made a few videos, and then after I made the videos, I actually got like random cold calls from people saying, if you want to start something, we'll put in money. Which for me as a writer was actually very sad because I've been writing for so long. Nobody calls me. I make a few videos and suddenly I'm getting all these calls for money. And of course, writing is my first love. I don't really enjoy making videos. I will if I have to. Certainly at the next election, I will if I have to, but don't enjoy it. But that actually made me think. The fact that people are putting up money made me think, oh, maybe there is a viable business option here, right? We can get funding. We can create a model that maybe now is the time. I also sense that Singaporeans were getting a bit more used to subscription products in general, right? Whether it's streaming services or whether it's the New York Times, my sense was Singaporeans are getting more used to paying, having that monthly fee on their credit card statement. So yeah, then I tried to raise money. I managed to raise money from a bunch of people, and then we started Jom. In terms of the math, I raised enough money for 2 years of operations. That's how I thought about it. In case we don't make a single cent, right, we could still go for 2 years. So that was my thinking about how much to raise. Because I didn't want to start a subscription model with a paywall, and then after 3 months we're out of money. So I raised enough money to everybody's on low salaries, but I raised enough money to last us for 2 years. And then now we've got subscription money coming in, and we only want to build our business off subs. So we don't have any other revenue stream at the moment. We sell some tote bags, which all of you should buy, but that's our main. We don't want to take advertising anytime soon. Maybe in the future we might, but we don't want to take advertising anytime soon because we understand the nature of the advertising market in Singapore. The government is by far the biggest advertiser. Even corporations, so we don't want to be in the pockets of corporations either, right? We want to be able to criticize the NTUCs of the world, the SIAs of the world, the big advertisers in traditional media, which I think because they advertise so much, sometimes people are afraid to write critically about them. So yeah, we're a purely reader-funded model.
So the independence is from readers, basically you are...
Yeah, so in terms of structural bias, and my main concern is, will our readership ever pull us in an ideological direction? Right, and I think the best recent example of this in the past maybe decade is with the New York Times during the Trump era, where the New York Times found that its readership, largely quite liberal Americans, was actually in a way subtly pulling it in a particular direction because with modern metrics as well, which are all around engagement and shares and likes and things like this, your piece that is attacking Trump is obviously going to be much more popular among your particular ideological base, right, than some of your other pieces. So how do you ensure that you're actually being comprehensive about how you cover, US national politics when your readership, which is your main constituent, just like it is for Jones, is pulling you in a particular direction? So yeah, that's a concern of mine. I think it's something we look out for, but we're still quite small, so I don't see that as a big danger as of yet. But in the future, it might be, because you could argue that our Jones readership comes from a particular ideological bent in Singapore, for sure, which also reflects, I think, the co-founders and the content that we put out. I will move on to the next question, which is, what kinds of activities does the term media cover? So I think there's this expansive idea that media can be anything, right? In today's world, it can be individual content creator on Instagram, it can be, big established media companies, and we all fall under this big umbrella called media. And so anyway, since the universe is so big, I thought, and I've given them a few examples for us to talk about, but I said instead of trying to define what the media covers, let's talk about some examples about who is not part of the media. And I had a few examples. I'd love to hear all your thoughts. So you know, Michelle Chong as Alian interviewing Shanmugam in his office. Is that part of the media? I don't know if anybody wanted to.
It's propaganda.
Is propaganda part of the media?
Okay, I will address this because this comes out as part of a book that we're going to publish soon. Yeah, so I actually don't like to distinguish between high or low media because I find that basically every media outlet, you're trying to gain a piece of the attention pie. And if you're successful, right, that means that you've got the tactics, whether it's dirty or low down, right? Unfortunately, public attention is fickle. So to survive in this media landscape, it's better not to say you're not media than to fight to get your own attention. So I would say that, yeah, Alian is also a media outlet and quite successful. So I better make sure that this upcoming book is going to do more numbers than Alian, right? Or maybe I get Alian to promote for me.
So so Kage, yours is the sort of expansive view, lah. So everything I've listed down here, and I'll just read it out.
Yeah, you should read that.
Xia Xue tweeting about society and politics. Is Xia Xue part of the media? Gov.sg Tele Channel. Is that part of the media? Aware Saga podcast, is that part of the media? Current Wild Rice production of Alfian's Play Hotel, is that part of the media? Are they all part of the media?
Okay, so media, because today I'm included also. I'm a book publisher. So in this expansive sense, yes, I think actually everything is part of media, and even Wild Rice's play, wow, that one stretched me a bit. I'm trying to figure out why. Although I find that it is storytelling and a fictive account of a history spanning 100 years, right? It's a great production, you all should have a look. Yeah, so this, is it media properly speaking? It is, I don't know why, but plays to me, when it goes into more artistic formats, right? I'm trying to grapple with the last insert, to be honest. But the remaining one, gov.sg, Aware Saga Podcast, those to me are very media because maybe they are primarily data driven. Yeah.
Ariffin, did you have any thoughts on these?
I think for me, I just take a very pragmatic approach, lah. Media, end of the day, is content, right? So like, as long as there is content, whether, because I think nowadays there's a lot of debates about like how media should be a certain way, it shouldn't be another way, sort of thing. But like, I think the reality of it, like for example, how many of you are on TikTok? Or how many of you consume TikTok? Really nobody. Okay, maybe the rest of you are shy. Yeah, so honestly, right, like I find TikTok, right, is a great way to democratize the space. Because like previously, right, you need like a good video setup and whatnot to actually get some audience, and you need some access. But then these days, right, on TikTok, you just see some angry guy in a car put his phone there and then start, and then that will go viral. So but then somebody who spent $5,000, $10,000 on the same production, but then some might take a view and say, okay, this guy is a lot more polished, this guy is a lot more refined. But at the end of the day, I think as long as people are consuming it, then that's media, right? So we shouldn't take a very, like, for the lack of a better word, like atas approach. And I think that if people are consuming it, that's a fact. Like what you say, sometimes the tactics are more dirty or more like low. But if people are consuming it, so be it. And sometimes we also have to adapt, I feel.
Yeah, I actually discussed this list with a colleague, our editorial lead in the middle, who's at the back of the room, and we were kind of ruminating over them. And I had to, I had to Google the word media, the definition, just to make sure that I'm not, I'm being silly about this. But I think in the end, it's mass communication on some scale. So on that note, all of them check the box of mass communication. Except, likewise, with Kage, I think the thing that stopped me was the play. And I wondered why too. I don't have a direct answer. I'm still not sure if I would consider it media or not. Because I would consider Netflix media, for example, and that's also fictional. Or, depending if you're watching a documentary, then that's data-driven. I also think, I agree with Kage on what he said, that it's less of, oh, I'm not like these people, you know, like they're different from me, they employ such and such methods, and more of like, these people are quite successful. Like, I mean, for all the crap that we might give to Xiaxue, she's very successful in getting attention. And we need to ask ourselves, why are we not so good in getting attention? What are we doing that is not, you know, I mean, we don't have, I mean, some of it, yeah, definitely is controversy. But in general, she has a huge following that is not necessarily controversial. And I think we pay attention to her when it's controversy, but her regular followers are there. And we need to ask ourselves, what is she putting out that we are not? And maybe there's something to be learned there. You know, if you can't win them, you know, join them, you know, that sort of thing. Yeah, and I think that's an important question to ask them. Yeah.
Just to return to a play, right? I just because of what Ying said, I suddenly feel that maybe when it's about cultural productions, in a theatre you have maybe 500 people, then that kind of relationship with the audience is very intimate. Somehow when we think about media, we tend towards mass media, the concept of mass media. Maybe that's a clue to why we are trying to figure whether it should be considered media. Yeah.
Yeah, so the space is important, and I guess one of the sub-points of that is, so if the theatre production was live streamed, or it was put on video, as many were done over COVID, then does that then qualify as media? But you know,
I would feel a bit more media-ish already. Yeah.
and I mean, I feel, you know, it's an independent media festival, but I think for me, some of these examples, it also gets at the distinction between journalism and media, right? Because if this was an independent journalism festival, for example, I think then maybe we might be a bit clearer with some of these examples, that we may not call them journalists. Or would you still call, is Michelle Chong, would you consider Michelle Chong interviewing, is she doing a journalist job there?
I think compared to Kirsten's work, it's definitely not journalism. Seriously, this is what I feel.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because I have trouble with it myself, because in the old days of journalism, there were all these gatekeepers around who can be a journalist, what qualifications you need, what experience you need, and that wasn't an ideal situation either. And now we've got a much more democratized media/journalist landscape, which brings about other sort of interesting complications as well.
Maybe, I think the intention is very important. Because when Michelle Chong did that interview with Shamungen, is it truly with a journalistic intent? Yeah, I think it's more advertorial, isn't it? Yeah, any thoughts? Yeah.
I think sorry. Yeah, I agree. I think to distinguish journalists, to like, okay, what qualifies as journalism, I think that intent is very important. And obviously, if you're accepting an interview as, it's almost like PR or even sponsored content, right? Which also then begs the question, is sponsored content journalism if it's paid for? But yeah, in that case, I think it's quite explicit that there is a goal in that process. But hot take, Xiaxue doing investigative journalism, right? When she like digs out receipts and she's like tweeting really hard or, you know, posting on Insta story. And I think, like, for example, she deep dives some cases, like when she received a lot of misogynistic hate at some point, she really went through people's profiles and did her own investigative journalism on the people who was crapping on her. I mean, that is, you know, a form of research that, and she really went out to verify her sources and things like that. And likewise, also when she covered I think the Night Owl cinematic saga, which maybe most of us here don't really don't care about, but really captured, you know, like half the country's imagination for a while. Yeah, I think she went to the source and she booked herself an interview and interviewed the people who were involved. I think, I mean, to give her some credit is a degree of journalistic work. Yeah. Maybe we can't really identify her as journalist, and then that also brings to the next question of are influencers journalists? Are influencers part of the media? But I think it's an interesting question.
We should have invited her.
Yeah, it should be.
Where's G? Anybody has thoughts on that? I'm going to move on to like more focused discussion on each of the outfits. But before I do that, yeah.
I want to ask a more general question, and
Sure.
I know it may seem obvious, but we haven't actually said it out loud. So why is independent media, and I think I'm more referring to news media, important, especially to Singapore? So I know it sounds obvious why, but I think we should articulate it. So why is it important? And my second question is really, how do people working in these things or running these things overcome the fear factor? And by fear factor, I mean being shut down, being persecuted, being made bankrupt, being put in jail, being exiled, and all of those things I just said actually have actual historical precedents. How do you overcome that?
I think maybe I also want to expand your question to include even, say, literary publishing. Because as I mentioned, imagination is really something we underrate in a very technocratic society. Actually, so they are kind of like a partnering, so you have knowledge, imagination, and anything that kind of censors that, it takes away our capacity to imagine solutions. So when you say why is independent media important, independent media is important because it is always going to be against the mainstream. That's why it is important, because if just now, I think Ariffin, you mentioned, if everybody say yes, there's a danger that is groupthink. We are all going to be lemmings one day if we do not have independent media. And the source of independence, right? It is actually, I find, coming from a place of wanting to do something useful. So what is helping us to manage the fear? You can't, I would say, overcome fear. Overcome fear sounds like, it's like you can paint over the fear with something bright and you kind of forget behind is actually something darker. I find that if you don't have fear, it's also very foolhardy. You will start to also, so I think there's a tension point. I was thinking about independent media and I thought that there's always a tension point and you're always held accountable by the powers to be. Because anything you say wrongly, defamation suit. You have to get your facts right. So in that sense, right, the structural bias keeps you very sharp and you have to be very careful with what you publish. So in that sense, I wouldn't say that there are strategies to overcome fear more than there are strategies to kind of live with the danger, the risk. Why do we want to do that? Because I feel that also earlier on, Sudhir said you wanted to be getting a Singapore readership before going overseas. All of us here, we want to tell stories that make sense to ourselves first and foremost. Otherwise, we can get enough stories from outside of Singapore, but we need our own storytellers. So that's why that independence, right, is also linked to our sense of who we are. So isn't that going to keep us going? So you will still see us struggling for a while, don't worry.
I think to answer the question of why do we need independent media, why is it important, there's a very duh one, which is being a check and balance on the powers that be, whoever is in Parliament right now. And beyond that though, I think independent media is important for inspiration and providing diversified sources. I think just in this fair alone, we can see independent media can take on many forms and varied ways, and it's important that people realize that, it's important that people see possibilities. And it's like, for example, if you're shopping for, say, the best earphones, like you want to buy a new set of earphones and you are shopping online, you don't want to take a recommendation just from one person. Maybe you really love that person and maybe you really think they're really great, but you always want to check, you want to do your homework, you want to ask 10 people, make sure you're getting your most bang for buck before you make an investment. I think making a decision about everyday life, about who you want to vote for the next election, about who you want to hire in your team, all of these things come from needing to read from a diversified source or a diversified number of sources. So even on this panel, we may not all agree. We may be like bent, I think, in a similar direction, but we all have very different takes on on the same issue. So I think it's important to recognize diversity for what you think is best for you. And your second question is about fear. I think fear is very real. It happens especially in a place like Singapore, and I can't think of any country or society where there is no fear, especially when the topic you're going to talk about is quite sensitive and controversial, but I think that is also a good sign, because that means you are going to say something important, and you worry what people will say about it or what they will think about it. And likewise, I think what Kaki said, I resonate with it. Yeah, it's not ideal, the situation we're in, but it keeps you very sharp. It makes you make sure that you really fact check everything you're saying. You leave no room for error, because if you do, then you kena POFMA, which really, really stinks. Nobody wants to kena POFMA. So I think, it's one of those negative, those toxic employer statements where they're like, the harder you work, the sharper you become. And I think likewise in Singapore, the harder they squeeze us, the better we become, right? So I think there's the element of that, right? We become smarter. We don't work harder, but we work smarter. Yeah, I think we become more innovative in finding solutions, and I think this independent media fair is like an idea of what a solution could look like, possibly. Yeah.
I have a question which actually I want to wait till the end, but there may be no time. I want to hear from your.
Oh wait, let's just.
Sorry. Sorry.
Do you have any response to?
Yeah.
that?
Sorry.
I think.
After this out.
Oh yeah. Sorry about that. I think basically the short answer to your question, right, is that if we don't have independent media, like a lot of the stories that we see in the past decade won't hit the news. Like for example, I think if not for independent news sources, we won't be discussing Radar Road in Parliament on Monday, right? If it's not for independent media, we won't be having the SPH circulation scandal. We won't be having DOC broke the Brompton bike saga about a decade ago. So there are a lot of examples, right? But I think the idea is that, going back to what Pei Ying said, right? Sometimes, of course, when sometimes people look at the independent media, they will say, okay, you are not balanced, right? So I think one of the best answers I've heard to that, right, is that we may not be balanced, but we are the balance, right? We bring the balance to the table. For example, if you go to UK or whatnot, you got your so-called left-wing papers, right-wing papers, centrist papers, this paper, that paper, sort of thing. So in that spread, right, there is your balance. In Singapore, you don't have that balance. So in a sense, I think the existence of independent media, although individually we may not be exactly balanced, and I hate that word, but we bring the balance, right? In terms of fear, right, as an outfit which has gotten POFMA twice before, one I agree with, one I don't agree with, but let it be. I think the idea is that after some time, right, is you learn from your mistakes, and you learn also from the mistakes of other people. So sometimes really, the difference, POFMA can be the difference between a question mark and a full stop, right? And then you learn how to, like what I always say, right, in primary school, you do show and tell, right? So what we learn how to do is, we show but we don't tell. That means if the reader reaches a certain conclusion on his own, he's pasal. We never say anything. We just show you A, we show you B. If you reach your own conclusion, that's your problem, right? So we also need to learn how to become creative, in a sense. Of course, I don't think anything can be without risk. Whatever we put out, there will still be risk, but sometimes you have to take it one personal example is the SPH story. When Wake Up Singapore broke the SPH story, till the end, right, we didn't have confirmation from SPH, right? So in a sense, we took a risk, right? For all we know, we could have published the story and then something happened behind the scenes. They say, screw you, nothing happened, right? But I think without risk, the stories, I think you'll get what I mean.
Hey, Ariffin, can you talk a bit more about how that came about? How did you get that scoop, and as much as you can share, or how did it come about? So Wake Up broke the SPH story.
Yep.
First media outlet in Singapore to break the SPH story.
Yeah.
Okay. And how did that happen?
Of course, without going into too much details, we heard it from some sources, and then my first reaction was, no freaking way lah. Because you know the allegations sounded ridiculous. You take paper, you go and burn the newspaper, you know, like you know, it sounded ridiculous. This is Singapore we're talking about, you know. But then certain parts of the story were verifiable in a sense where certain people did lose their jobs at that time, right? So then we were thinking like, okay, then of course we learned from all our previous POFMAs. POFMAs are the best teachers, let me tell you, okay? Yeah. So then we started emailing a whole bunch of people, including people, our friends who, you know, from the media and whatnot. We do have friends in the media, okay? So, I mean, I find that the journalists are all okay, but I mean, let's not go there. Yeah, so then we started emailing and we stonewall. So after a while, right, we needed to make a decision, okay, to say, okay, these are the facts. We have no official confirmation from the other side. Do we proceed? And of course, we got certain people that we cannot quote or what, but they have verified. So end of the day, it's a decision you have to make, whether you want to press publish or not, right? And I remember speaking to Balji, right? He's one of our, I mean, a friend of ours, right? So
Distinguished former editor in Singapore, for those who may not know.
Yeah. Don't worry, it's nothing to do with the story, right? So but I just asked him like, you know, I was just sharing with him that I feel very after we prepped something, I was telling him, I feel very anxious. And then he said, hold on to that feeling because that's when you know you're onto something, right? Also, maybe you're into big trouble, right? But this time, thankfully, it wasn't, Yeah, so like that 24 to 48 hours when there was radio silence from SPH, right? That was a bit scary, yeah. And then SPH say, yeah, we screwed up. Then you feel more relaxed. But then there is a risk, yeah.
Wait, so I mean, in a way, it's interesting. Like this is like establishment institution whistleblower type story, and you guys somehow broke it, as opposed to, you know, whistleblowing outside of the establishment, which I more commonly associate wake up stories with, right?
No, I won't tell you where the whistleblower is from.
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, you know, it's something that happened within the establishment, and you guys get to know about it first. However you got to know about it without mentioning.
Yeah, and I think it was designed in a way where people outside were not meant to know. Without going into the details, but I think the way it was orchestrated, designed in a way for people outside not meant to know.
I see.
Can I ask a question? Yeah. Which is the big question. I wanted to wait to the end, but here we talk about independent media, and we have, of course, established media. But the question is actually a personal question, which I hope you will address with some talk. Is why you? Why are you doing this? You know it's a POFMA, risks, struggles. Why are you doing it? You know, because I just read that thing which was in John the other day about the winds of change, right? 30 years ago, those guys had something about, wow, there's going to be winds of change, things will happen. 30 years later, nothing happens. So are you also at this point in time, it's really a fruitless struggle. You're doing it, you're struggling, you're fighting. Why do it? I mean, this was asked of yesterday's Kevin Tan, so somebody
The beauty is in the struggle.
But do establish that. We want to hear, you know. I mean, any of you, I'm sure, if you wanted to get a better job, making lots of money, no problem. But you continue to want to do this. Why?
On better job, actually, you are you full time? Wake up now?
No.
Oh, you're not.
Yeah.
Okay. Ariffin is a lawyer. I mean,
In August.
In August, what?
In August, I will get called to the bar.
In August, you get called to the bar. So, are you going to choose the lucrative option or the struggle?
I was gonna choose the struggle until I heard his question.
Can somebody please remove this?
Yeah, I mean, just a quick reply. Good question. I think I ask myself that sometimes too, because especially for me, I think being a woman in the media business and also being a woman, you know, a female leader in my own team, and I tell you, managing Gen Zs and millennials is really, really tough. It's really, the mental load of management is way more stressful than like running these articles. I stay up at night thinking of how my co-workers will respond to an initiative I have planned, or like, and things like that. Or like the next day I have to have a difficult work conversation. Oh my god, how's that going to go? That keeps me up more at night than like publishing something sensitive. Yeah, I think for me it's a belief that we will eventually realize some change, however minimal it might be. And I think even in the media space, when I was 20, I read TOC, and I was so inspired by TOC. And I think we've come so far from last time we just had TOC, we had nothing else. We've come so far from that, and now I think more and more young people are more emboldened to say things that last time people were like, they called I remember this is the look over your shoulder effect at a coffee shop. You wouldn't even dare to say some of these things that people are like blasting on their social media pages now. And I think that's because independent media exists, because people who are willing to push the boundaries and willing to say things that other people weren't willing to say, said things that everyone had on their minds but no one had the courage to, and that created space for other people to lean in and say, okay, I actually think I also have an opinion, I also want to say something. And that change might not be very obvious in the day-to-day elements of our work, but after years, after decades, I think you will eventually see it.
You done already?
So,
I go first. Actually, I've been thinking also of the concept of public space. Yesterday night, I had a wonderful dinner with a writer, and we talked about public space. And public space is such an interesting concept, right? Like, where are the lines? And you know that you need a public space, but who polices public space? It's like now this is a physical concept, public space, but also the boundaries change. So for example, if you stay in a HDB flat, the corridor outside is where you meet people. You can actually be friendly, you can be insular, but if you don't engage with public space, right, it becomes a dead zone. And it is still a part of your world. So similarly for media landscape, right, there's this space that we are all in, whether or not you are doing anything, it is there. And then one day when you need it and it's dead, right, you might actually regret that you didn't do anything. So how I think we all found our way into media, I think we have our own stories. So when the chance came for me to be part of a publishing house, I found that it appealed to my understanding of concepts like public space, concepts of like what I like to read. I read Charin George's Air-Conditioned Nation when I was 18 years old or something. So, and I was thinking, wow, this is a great piece of work, and it's a Singapore academic who did it, a journalist turned academic who did it. So I was really inspired. I think there's always that part of us that we are inspired by something we have read. So that chance and that choice came together, and so yeah. Anyway, it's not like we are. I say we are struggling, but we do enjoy our work also. So it is really quite meaningful, because when you're in a media space where there's not a lot of profit, you meet very genuine people. I think that's a lot more true for places that don't have a lot than places where there's too much. Yeah.
For me personally, I like to think of it as planting seeds, you know. So I mean, Wake Up Singapore as an organization, as an outfit, right? We do have, not say our biases, but we do have the things that we do stand for, and we are very clear about it since day one, right? What is our position on the death penalty? What's our position on LGBT rights? What's our position on migrant worker rights? What's our position on working class people? Things like that, right? So we do have our position on these issues, and also more political, socio-political issues, right? So the idea is that, what's that? the idea is that we plant seeds lah. That means every article, every content that we put out, right, serves as a seed, right? So I'm quite confident that none of us have ever read a single article that changed our mind entirely on something, right? I mean, can any of us say that we read one article and we changed our minds, right? Yeah. So, but a lot of times it's this constant messaging, different forms of saying the same thing, and consistency over time, real life examples that eventually makes you change your mind lah. So sometimes I feel like when you keep pushing stuff out there, right, one day something will resonate with somebody and you won't know, because sometimes it's hard to put a value to these things. It's hard to put a value to, for example, shifting public opinion. Like, okay, I mean, all of us like to talk in terms of elections, right? Just think of it as this way, okay? A 5% swing can be the difference, a national 5% swing, right, can be in your various constituencies, your SMCs, your GRCs, all these, right? A 5% swing can be the difference between a super majority and what we have today, right? So 5% here, 5% there. So in a sense, you don't really know the impact of your work, and I think that's the beauty of it lah. So you won't know the impact of your work. You don't know how many minds it might change or not change. So I think in that not knowing, right, that's what keeps you going lah. The opportunity to continue playing in that space.
Do you think if you know it's a concrete war, then you know the not knowing disappear, will you still do what you do? This is for when you turn lawyer in August.
Depends on what the results show lah.
Yeah, I would just like to add that actually I do think it's very fulfilling in many ways. So, you know, it often gets talked about as a struggle and the fear and the paranoia, but there's actually a lot of joy, not just within working at JOM, but in our collaborations across the different media outfits. And also I think in terms of the feedback that we have today versus 30, 40 years ago when, you know, A Shift in the Wind was written. So that was a book written by, you know, a bunch of people, some of whom eventually got arrested as alleged Marxist conspirators, which is what you're referring to. You know, and I've talked to Casey and others, right? I mean, you're operating much more in a silo back then. Today, because of social media, because of the internet, because of everything, there's a lot more positive feedback for what people like us are trying to do. So it's not, you know, it's just a different time, I think. I'm going to race through a couple of last questions because I realize there's only 20 minutes. And you guys can come in whenever you want. But I thought one of the things you mentioned about data-driven storytelling and Kage about the importance of imagination, I'll just go to the last question that I had for you, which is what are the perils of dataocracy, what some people call the fetishization of quantification? What do you think cannot be captured by pure data-driven storytelling? And do you think that in Singapore there's maybe too much of a dependence on data for our understanding of life?
Yeah, that's 3 questions packed as one. Yes, I think this is something that recently we've been thinking a lot more about as an editorial outfit, at being that, you know, data-driven explicitly. So we're definitely advocates of using data to drive our stories, but I think we have to be very aware that data is still not absolute truth. It captures, you know, whatever, you know, number when you do a survey and you respond to it, you know, when you receive a phone call on the phone and you're like, oh, you know, your household does this, or, you know, in the end, it's just a number on an Excel spreadsheet, right? Or a word on an Excel spreadsheet, some sort of category. And it captures only a fleeting moment in time. And it's not everyone's, like, it's not coloring reality like as an absolute truth. So I think there's still a lot of things that, you know, qualitative elements need to come in to support. And which is why in our team, actually we talk about data-driven storytelling, but we end up always just being very visual visual storytellers. We supplement with audio clips, we supplement with illustrations, with interviews, and those elements are really important in humanizing the data, and realizing that, you know, it's not just a number that we're talking about, which when we show you a chart, it can dehumanize a situation. So it's very important to rehumanize it, I guess, if that's the word, and bring in the empathy, right? 2 examples, very quick one. For example, COVID. When we talk about the loss of lives on the scale of millions, that's that can be very dehumanizing. You know, it's just one single digit in a million digits, right? But when you add a name, immediately you feel that sense of loss in a very real way when you name that person, when you name that individual. So there's a lot of debate within the data journalism field of how do we talk about COVID? How do we show loss in a way that's empathetic, in a way that's, you know, draws out the humanity in people also. And likewise, I think for us, when we were working on our piece on sexual violence, we thought a lot about this. Like, how do we give credit, not give credit, but how do we represent, you know, these individuals who went through these very traumatic events in a meaningful way? How do we, you know, represent the traumatic spaces that they live in without, you know, explicitly showing violence? Yeah, so I think we had a little chart, well, it's called a tree map chart, where we drew everyday spaces, but we colored it with a very somber tone, and we colored it with a sense of danger. So I think it's about, yeah, like again, in a visual way, very technical way, how do we bring the empathy back to those data points? I think Singapore, yeah, like, I think, contrary to what we think, I don't think Singapore actually makes that many data-driven decisions. We may, in terms of like financial stuff, like land and trade, and like, you know, during COVID, like we get our eggs from Ukraine. But we don't, I think, do that enough with social issues, because if you really cared about the data will speak for itself. For example, if we recently worked with the Migrant Death Map team, which if you all haven't heard about them, they're a wonderful group of activists who really spend so much of their personal effort and time to comb through newspaper reports to build this wonderful resource that now you can go and research and look at about how many migrant deaths there have been in the country and what do they die from. Or if they receive injury or experience injury, what is the injury from? And if you look at that, you will find the majority of migrant worker deaths are workplace related. And even within that, most of them are construction related, such as falling from height or being crushed to death. This is data. And if you really cared about it, about making a data-informed decision, you will realize that laws are not enough. Systemic issues need to be solved with not just putting out a law, but checking that employers follow the law and not just take on a compliance mindset, but put safety atop of mind of everything they do. Like, we would not do that to, you know, we would not expect everyday Singaporeans to work in these very unsafe, hostile environments, but for some reason with migrant workers, we can, I don't know, tell ourselves a different story and close one eye. And the data is there, like it speaks for itself. And I think if we really, I'm sure MOM has this data too, and I think if they really, you know, were very, very worried about it, they would do something about it and make a data-driven decision.
Yeah, and I'll run through one question quickly with Kage. And if you all have any questions, please let me know. Yeah, let me just get through this Kage question, and then yeah, I'll have enough time for a few more questions. Because I know G was quite interested in this. Ethos is going into ebooks in a big way. What do you see as the challenges and successes of this, and do you envision ebooks becoming a part of the online discourse more so than print?
Actually, we are quite medium agnostic in the sense that stories, right, we need to find the right medium. So for ebooks, we are going to digital because, right, a lot of reading happened on ebooks during the pandemic especially. So the library loans, wow, you just go and look at the public data available. So to be online is about, being on ebook platform is about accessibility. So Ji Leong, because he's also a fellow publisher, he's wondering whether, I think he's also thinking, are there more sales, right, when it comes to ebooks? Our total percentage of revenue from ebook sales, right, out of total book revenue is only 5% at the moment. Yeah, but that is because we are being very careful with our rollout plan. Unfortunately, as a publishing house that depends on sales, right, we cannot be careless about, say, how we work with even public loans. For example, if a new title comes out and is immediately available in libraries, how would that impact on our sales, right? We have to think carefully about that. So what we have figured out is that we need to have a strategy to work with libraries as well. So this is the current thinking. We need to be accessible digitally. That's why we are on ebooks. The longer term thinking is we are probably going to move towards a shared economy in future, in the sense that you see public loans becoming more important. But the problem with Singapore policy and infrastructure is that we don't have a public lending right as in 35 countries in the world. A public lending right, for example, in the UK would mean that if a library has a certain loan for a certain title, the author will get a percentage of earnings from the library loan. So that means that it's going back to the creator as well. So if the public infrastructure doesn't support a shared economy properly, right, and us diving headlong into putting out all our books on public library loans, right, is a foolish decision also. So currently we need to be accessible. As a revenue model for ebooks, right, we also have to see how it pans out. But for us, paperback is actually more important at the moment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, a lot of business stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, because it's a lot of your stuff already we talked about.
Is there a question at the back?
Yeah.
In a corner?
Who? Okay.
Mine's very quick.
Him, then you. Yeah.
I'm asking, thank you very much for your time, guys. I'm actually asking on behalf of my friend who couldn't be here today. I'm just wondering if you guys had any thoughts. You mentioned it a few times today in your chat, right? But this is about POFMA. So I'm wondering if you guys had any quick thoughts about the Online Criminal Harms Act, and I guess specifically from me, whether POFMA itself has evolved into something of a badge of honor for journalists today, because it shows that institutions are very afraid of what they can say. Any quick thoughts from any of you? Thank you.
I know there was one period in time where people were using this phrase "POFMA baiting," right? In the idea that any publicity is good publicity, but there's no journalist that I really know that actually want to get a POFMA. I think we tried not to get a POFMA. My reading of it, and I guess Ariffin might disagree because you said one of your POFMAs you didn't really agree with, but my reading of the use of POFMA so far is that when it's been used on journalists or the media, there's been some possible error, some likely error. When it's been used on politicians, most famous example was Paul Tambaya at the last election. When it's been used on politicians, that's different. I can see a clear political agenda there. But when POFMA has been used on journalists and media outfits, and this includes the mainstream media, Hardware Zone got a POFMA as well. Hardware Zone is owned by SPH. So my view, when it's been used on journalists, there has actually been some journalistic error there at the heart of it. I don't agree with the tool. I think there are other ways to address it, but that's my view on POFMA.
I think even when it comes to sometimes, for us, right, the POFMA that I don't agree with was when we were reporting on a political story. So I think even when it's amongst about Raisa Khan and stuff like that. So yeah, but I think POFMA is quite an interesting thing today because about 10 years ago, right, sometimes you say, oh, if there's no defamation suit, that means it must be true, right? So sometimes these days, right, when a story breaks out, let's say your readout road or whatnot, and there's no POFMA for a few days, and then people start to say, never POFMA leh, So, yeah, I don't know how they're going to deal with that lah. And knowing them, their answer is going to be more legislation, right? So then you have your Online Crimes Act, Online Harms, whatever act. So I think it will be more of the same lah, right? Because I think a lot of times, actually the government is capable of dealing with falsehoods without POFMA, right? And they have shown it a lot of times. A lot of times, let's say something they don't agree with, right? They release their own statement. And then they will continue, and then both sides just have their own response and people make up their own minds, right? So I think that should be the way, and they have done it before. It's just that sometimes their use of POFMA also is a bit puzzling because they will use POFMA for certain things like certain sensitive topics. Other topics they are okay to issue a response, or sometimes they will discuss it in Parliament where the person who made the statement got no, I mean you would know, yeah, so no chance to respond, and you know, it's an inconsistent approach. I think the fundamental approach should be, if there's something that you as a government disagree with, you have your right of response, and that should be the end of it. People should decide for themselves.
I think maybe about the badge of honor part, right? I find that when I look at our book circulation, right, I understand that maybe the predominant readership, they are still very center. So when you get POFMA, right, you're actually being alienated from the center and of course the establishment leaning readers. So even if you feel good, right, it's a badge of honor, effectively it doesn't help you to also reach out to the people who you want to speak to as well. So I think that's important to take note of. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, maybe I'm just going back to basics. But I wanted to ask about your statement of being data-driven. So twice now you've mentioned examples where you've taken the data from newspaper stories. Are you talking about the main newspaper in Singapore, and how can you sort of justify using what someone has reported and they've already interpreted the data themselves, and then saying that you're interpreting that through their eyes? You're not actually going straight back to basics, the data, the actual data. And if in Singapore, just the second part is, in Singapore, most of the data that's collected are from ministries. These are already biased. So how exactly do you collect your data, and how are you analyzing that? How are you critiquing it?
Yeah, those are really good questions. So for example, if you want to do a story like, you know, the piece that we did on sexual violence, or, you know, about, you know, migrant worker injury and death, like, I think you can like keep banging on the door. The data will never like come from the government. They're never going to make the data open. And that's also because we don't have certain legislation like, you know, elsewhere would have. You can have a right to request certain data sets and information. And I think to then just be like, oh, okay lah, no data, then don't write lah. I mean, we can't. That's not satisfying, right? That's not a good response. So I think our way around it is to then be very aware of what we're drawing from the paper. So when we publish a story like this, for both stories, we're very transparent with our methods. We tell people very completely openly, like, this is where we got the data from. These are limitations. These are the considerations that we've taken. And when we choose to draw from newspapers, we choose topics that we know that not necessarily, I mean, there will be some filter for sure, but I think we pick topics that we know there is still a good body of facts that we can draw upon. So when we crown newspapers, we didn't look for like, oh, what did they say? Because a lot of these are like somebody sitting in the courtroom, you know, watching a trial, and then they kind of take notes, right? So we don't look at like, oh, what did they say about what went on in the courtroom, and we look more of like things like, what's the age of the victim, what was the age of the perpetrator, where did they meet? So it's all facts, so we draw out the facts. But we are also very aware that then our study becomes completely on, these are the cases that actually reached to this level of evidence and threshold to even go to trial. And there's probably a ton of cases that did not even reach that threshold of evidence, especially in a topic like sexual violence. So we acknowledge that too in our piece, to say that the actual number is probably way, way, way higher. But this is what we can meaningfully describe from what we have. And likewise from the migrant worker story, that's a similar method that we employ.
Yep.
I would like to ask, do you think we should attempt to popularize our independent media? And do you think that our independent media will ever, right, evolve and grow to become an active player in the mainstream media?
We won't be anywhere near that.
Yeah, yeah. No, and just to add on to that, I think this, you know, you touched on it earlier when you talked about papers on different ends of the political spectrum and balance and things like that, right? And we often in the independent media feel like we need to fill spaces that are not being filled, right? And that means non-mainstream discourse. But perhaps, yeah, at some point in time, we'll quote unquote graduate to a level where you actually feel that you need to include all forms of discourse, even the forms of discourse now that are captured by the mainstream media. So yeah, do you guys have any thoughts about?
Yeah, I think mainstream now is we use that word to describe, I think, the predominant news sort of churn or creation process now. I think, like, you know, it's, you can verify something is, yeah, okay, yeah, actually happened because Straits Times has reported it. But I think if you, especially what I see as a trend, if you actually approach young people and you ask them, what are you reading? Very, very few of them actually read mainstream media. And a lot of them are like, they better not, because they don't feel empowered, they don't feel equipped. It doesn't, you know, keep them, you know, I think abreast of what's going on. And you will find that actually a lot of them follow different alternative media outlets or independent media outlets on social media. And, you know, and that's what I also see predominantly young people consuming and sharing on their social media pages. So there's a huge shift. And if mainstream media doesn't catch up, they will be left behind. So I think it's, now, you know, it's like, recently actually Reuters Institute put out a very good survey and research piece on the state of media in Singapore. And I think, like, increasingly people are reading things like Mothership and Rise. They still value, you know, Straits Times Today and CNN for, like, trust. Then they know that, okay, something's published there, it's true, it's confirmed true. But then for, like, really for value add, they don't go there, they go elsewhere. So I think I think we are already, in my opinion, we are already mainstream. I mean, definitely Wake Up Singapore is a huge following, so they are quite mainstream, I would say. Yeah, it's just depending on who you choose to speak to. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
You should have seen Ariffin's face, man.
I mean, what's the definition of mainstream, right? But I mean, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I hope, did we answer? Yeah, I guess, I don't know, hope we answered your question. And we should probably wrap it up now. So thanks to all the panelists. And